The ripping sound echoed across Jefferson High's courtyard like a gunshot. Lily Patterson's floral dress, the one her grandmother had sewn with trembling hands before she passed, hung in tatters while 200 students watched in stunned silence. Chase Hawthorne stood there holding fabric, his Harvard-bound smile never wavering. He had no idea he'd just awakened something that would shatter his perfect world in exactly 47 seconds. What happened next would be replayed 50 million times across social media, spark a federal investigation, and transform how America talks about power in schools. But the real story, the one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about quiet girls and loud boys, that starts 3 hours earlier, in room 237, where Lily Patterson was about to discover that sometimes silence isn't golden. It's just fear wearing a prettier name. Lily Patterson had perfected the art of invisibility at Jefferson High. 4.0 GPA. National Merit semifinalist. Fluent in 3 languages, yet somehow managed to blend into lockers like wallpaper. At 16, she possessed the kind of gentle presence that made teachers forget she existed until grade sheets reminded them of her excellence. What 1,847 students didn't know was that those clumsy movements in PE, they were deliberate. Those weak wrists that couldn't open water bottles, pure performance. Because at age 8, after her father's discipline sent her to the ER for the 3rd time, Lily's grandmother had enrolled her in judo with one rule: never let them see your strength until you absolutely need it. 10 years later, those calloused palms hidden under oversized sleeves could throw a grown man through a window. But Lily had learned that survival meant staying small, staying silent, staying safe in the shadows where predators couldn't find her. The morning of October 15th started like every other Tuesday at Jefferson High. Students shuffling through hallways with that particular blend of teenage exhaustion and drama that had become background noise. Lily sat in the front row of AP History, her notebook already filled with meticulous notes, while most classmates struggled to stay awake. Ms. Catherine Wells stood at the whiteboard, her 28-year-old frame carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that teaching meant navigating minefields disguised as lesson plans. She'd been at Jefferson for exactly 1 year, long enough to understand the unspoken rules about which students could be challenged and which ones required careful handling. The announcement came at 8:15 a.m. During the morning bulletin period, when Principal Sterling's voice crackled through speakers with bureaucratic authority. "Today we celebrate our National Merit Scholarship semi-finalists," he declared, his tone carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone reading from a script. These outstanding students represent the academic excellence that makes Jefferson High a beacon of educational achievement. Ms. Wells pulled up the list on her computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she recognized what was about to unfold. Lily's name topped the list, followed by 3 other students whose families didn't own auto dealerships or fund new gymnasium wings. Chase Hawthorne's name was notably absent. "Congratulations to all our semi-finalists," Ms. Wells announced, her voice carefully neutral as she read each name aloud. Especially Lily, whose essay on institutional inequality was quite insightful, addressing systemic barriers that prevent equal access to educational opportunities. The classroom temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, Chase's jaw tightening as every word landed like a personal attack. At 17, he owned Jefferson High the way his father owned 3 auto dealerships and 2 city council members. Student council president, varsity quarterback, early decision acceptance to Harvard already secured through a combination of legacy admission and strategic donations. But perfection was a prison, and Chase had learned that controlling others was the only way to feel powerful when his surgeon father controlled every breath he took. The prescription Adderall in his backpack wasn't for ADHD. It was fuel for the performance anxiety that came with being the Hawthorne legacy. And when the pills didn't work, breaking others did. Must be nice. Chase's voice carried that particular private school politeness that dripped venom. Having so much time to study when you don't have real responsibilities. Lily's knuckles whitened around her pencil, the same grip she'd been taught for wrist control, but she remained silent. 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility had taught her that responding to provocation only invited more attention. Ms. Wells pretended not to hear, her own memories of high school humiliation making her throat tight. She'd been the scholarship kid once, the target who'd learned that teachers rarely intervened when it mattered most. Now, she was the teacher, but the fear remained, paralyzing her when courage was needed most. Emma Richardson sat in the back row, her manicured nails digging crescents into her palm as she processed what Lily's recognition meant for her own carefully constructed social empire. As Jefferson's undisputed queen bee, Emma had built her power on exclusivity, on being better than everyone else in ways that mattered to teenage hierarchies. But academic achievement, that was Lily's territory, a realm where Emma's father's pharmaceutical fortune couldn't buy superiority. The jealousy burned like acid, eating away at the confidence that came from always having more, always being more, always mattering more than girls like Lily Patterson. Dylan Cross shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing the predatory gleam in Chase's eyes that preceded systematic destruction. As a scholarship kid from the wrong side of town, Dylan understood the delicate balance required to survive in Chase's orbit. He'd spent 3 years as a reluctant satellite, orbiting the Golden Boy's gravitational pull while watching smaller planets get destroyed. The bell rang, releasing students into hallways that buzzed with the particular energy of teenage gossip spreading at viral speed. Lily gathered her books with practiced efficiency, hoping to disappear into the crowd before Chase's attention could focus entirely on her. But disappearing had become impossible the moment her name topped that list. By lunch period, the social ecosystem of Jefferson High had shifted in ways that only teenagers could detect. Conversation stopped when Lily passed, not from admiration, but from the anticipation that comes before public execution. Emma's followers sensed blood in the water, their loyalty to power making them eager participants in whatever cruelty was being orchestrated. The cafeteria stretched before Lily like a minefield, each table representing territory controlled by different factions of teenage royalty. She chose her usual spot in the corner, far from the center stage where social dramas typically unfolded, and opened her worn copy of Beloved while unwrapping her grandmother's leftover lasagna. The approach was choreographed, Emma's stilettos clicking against linoleum as she led her court toward Lily's table. The targeting was precise, designed for maximum humiliation with minimum adult intervention. "Is that a garage sale dress?" Lily Emma's voice carried across 3 tables, ensuring maximum audience participation. "My mom donates better clothes to Goodwill." The lie burned because the dress was handmade with love, not bought with Daddy's credit card, but Lily had learned that defending herself only provided more ammunition. She kept her eyes on Morrison's words, letting literature shield her from Emma's manufactured cruelty. Chase appeared like a shark scenting blood, his timing perfect as phones emerged from pockets and conversations died. "Leave her alone, Emma," he said with mock concern. "Can't you see? She's trying to blend in with the furniture." The cafeteria laughed, that pack mentality sound that strips humanity from both hunter and prey. Lily's breathing shifted, the calm before technique that her sensei had called mushin, the mind without mind, action without thought, response without emotion. Views meant validation in their digital ecosystem, and Chase understood that destroying others in public created currency more valuable than his father's money. He pulled out his own phone, angling for the perfect shot of suburban royalty putting trailer trash in her place. But Lily wasn't trailer trash, and she wasn't helpless. And the breathing techniques that looked like anxiety were actually preparation for something Emma and Chase couldn't comprehend. 10 years of martial arts training had taught her that the strongest technique was the one your opponent never saw coming. "You should eat in the bathroom," Chase continued, his voice carrying that casual cruelty that came from never experiencing consequences. "That's where people like you belong." The words hit their target, each syllable designed to wound. But Lily's response wasn't tears or submission. Instead, she looked up from her book, meeting Chase's gaze with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "People like me?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent cafeteria. "What kind of people are those?" Chase. The question hung in the air like a challenge, unexpected from someone who'd spent 3 years accepting every insult without response. Chase felt a flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in his confidence as he processed this deviation from Lily's usual script. Dylan watched from his table, recognizing something dangerous building in the space between predator and prey. Emma stepped back instinctively, her social radar detecting a shift in power dynamics that her privilege hadn't prepared her to handle. Ms. Wells appeared in the cafeteria doorway, drawn by the crowd's unusual silence, but froze when she saw the tableau unfolding. Her teacher training said intervene, but her survival instincts whispered about parent phone calls and administrative pressure, and the last teacher who'd tried to protect a student from the Hawthorne family's influence. That teacher had transferred districts within a month. "The people who think they can buy respect," Lily continued, closing her book with deliberate precision, "but don't understand the difference between fear and admiration." Chase's face flushed red, his pharmaceutical-enhanced confidence cracking as 200 students witnessed the quiet girl speak truth to power. Nobody talked to him like that. Nobody questioned his authority. Nobody made him look weak in front of his subjects. "You're going to regret that," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than any shout. "Nobody disrespects me in my school." "Your school?" Lily stood slowly, her movement fluid and controlled in ways that made Dylan's breath catch. "I wasn't aware Jefferson High had been renamed Hawthorne Academy." The crowd stirred, sensing something unprecedented unfolding before their eyes. Emma's mouth fell open, her social hierarchy crumbling as the quiet girl she'd dismissed revealed steel beneath silk. Chase stepped forward, using his height advantage to loom over Lily, but she didn't shrink or retreat. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him with the analytical mind of someone who'd learned to read aggression like a language. "We'll finish this conversation later," Chase promised, his words carrying the weight of inevitable retribution. "When there aren't so many witnesses." Lily smiled then, for the first time in 3 years at Jefferson High. It was a smile that made Emma step backward, that made Dylan remember stories about sleeping tigers, that made Chase feel something he'd never experienced before. Real fear. "I look forward to it," Lily replied, her voice carrying an odd certainty that sent ripples through the watching crowd. The final bell of the day released 1,847 students into Jefferson's sprawling courtyard, afternoon sunlight painting brick buildings gold, while teenagers erupted into the freedom of dismissal. Lily walked toward the bus stop, her grandmother's floral dress catching light as she navigated through clusters of conversation and teenage chaos. She'd made it exactly 47 steps before Chase intercepted her path with surgical precision. Going somewhere. Scholarship, girl. His voice carried across the courtyard, designed to attract maximum attention. We're not done talking. Emma flanked left, her designer heels clicking against concrete as she positioned herself for optimal humiliation angles. Dylan reluctantly took right, his moral compass screaming protests that his survival instincts overruled. A triangle of power, perfectly choreographed to trap prey in the center. 200 students formed a spontaneous amphitheater, phones emerging like flowers seeking sunlight, their screens capturing what promised to be another chapter in Chase Hawthorne's reign of teenage terror. That dress. Chase's fingers reached toward the floral fabric, his movement deliberate and invasive. Looks expensive for someone who can't afford to belong here. The grab was aggressive, territorial, designed to establish dominance through physical violation. His fingers twisted in cotton that represented more than clothing. It was love, memory, connection to a grandmother who'd sewn protection into every stitch. The rip was inevitable, the sound echoing across Jefferson's courtyard like breaking bones. Lily's grandmother's dress hung in tatters, floral patterns destroyed by hands that had never created anything beautiful, never sacrificed anything meaningful, never understood that some things couldn't be bought or replaced or repaired. Chase held the torn fabric like a trophy, his Harvard smile never wavering as he surveyed his destruction. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Accidents happen when you dress above your station." Emma laughed first, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. Then her followers joined, then the crowd, because mob mentality is a virus that spreads faster than compassion or conscience or basic human decency. 200 phones captured Lily Patterson's humiliation for eternal playback, each lens a witness to teenage cruelty elevated to performance art. She stood there, exposed in every sense, while privileged children recorded her pain for social media entertainment. But something in her posture shifted, invisible to untrained eyes, but unmistakable to anyone who understood the difference between submission and preparation. The quiet girl was becoming something else, something dangerous, something that Chase Hawthorne's money couldn't buy or his privilege couldn't protect him from. Dylan felt it first, that atmospheric change that preceded storms, his scholarship kid instincts screaming warnings that his position in Chase's orbit couldn't afford to hear. Emma sensed it too, stepping backward without conscious thought, as predator-prey dynamics shifted in ways her social programming hadn't prepared her to process. Ms. Wells appeared at the courtyard entrance, drawn by the crowd's energy, her cell phone halfway to her ear before she registered what was happening. The scene froze her finger above emergency numbers, because calling for help meant paperwork, meant questions, meant choosing sides in wars that young teachers rarely survived. "Chase," Lily's voice cut through the laughter like a blade, not pleading or broken, but carrying something that made the hair on his neck rise. Not Mr. Hawthorne or Sir or any of the submission he'd come to expect from his victims, just his name, spoken like a judgment. The crowd sensed the atmospheric change, conversations dying as 200 teenagers suddenly understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Dylan took an unconscious step backward, his working-class survival instincts recognizing danger that his privileged classmates couldn't perceive. "You're going to apologize," Lily continued, her voice carrying a strange calm that made Chase's pharmaceutical confidence falter. "You're going to pay for this dress." And you're going to leave me alone." Chase laughed, but the sound came out forced, hollow, like an actor forgetting his lines mid-performance. "Or what?" "Charity case. You'll cry to your guidance counselor." The smile that spread across Lily's face was unlike anything Jefferson High had ever seen. Terrible and beautiful, and absolutely certain. It was the smile of someone who'd spent 10 years learning to harness violence like a surgeon harnesses scalpels. Precisely, purposefully, without waste or hesitation. "No, Chase," she said quietly, her voice carrying across 200 held breaths. "I'm going to teach you what real power looks like." Chase reached for her again, because boys like him never learned when to stop, because privilege had taught him that consequences were for other people, because in his 18 years of existence, nobody had ever made him face the difference between fear and respect. His hand never made contact, and as Lily Patterson moved like water, like something that had studied violence as carefully as calculus, Chase Hawthorne was about to discover that some lessons can't be bought, can't be avoided, and definitely can't be forgotten. Lily moved like water, like something that had studied violence as carefully as she'd studied calculus, her left hand trapping Chase's wrist with precision that spoke of countless hours perfecting technique. Her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus, driving air from lungs that had never struggled for breath, never fought for anything more challenging than Daddy's approval. The Ogoshi, major hip throw, was textbook perfect, executed with the fluid grace of someone who understood that real power came from physics, not privilege. Chase Hawthorne's 180 pounds of entitlement sailed through autumn air, his designer jacket flapping like broken wings before meeting concrete with a sound that silenced 200 teenagers. Time stopped, the way it does when reality shifts so dramatically that minds struggle to process what eyes have witnessed. Chase lay motionless, his Harvard-bound confidence scattered across Jefferson's courtyard like his designer sunglasses, cracked and useless and suddenly worthless. Emma Richardson's manicured hand flew to her mouth, her perfectly applied lipstick framing a gasp that emerged as barely audible whisper. The social hierarchy she'd spent 3 years constructing crumbled in real time, because if Chase Hawthorne could be brought low by quiet Lily Patterson, then everything they'd believed about power was wrong. Dylan Cross felt his phone trembling in his hands, the device capturing every frame of teenage royalty's spectacular fall from grace. His finger hovered over the stop button, torn between loyalty to power and fascination with justice, between fear of consequences and hunger for truth. Ms. Wells stood frozen in the courtyard entrance, her emergency call dying half-dialed as she processed the impossible tableau before her eyes. 3 years of teaching had prepared her for many scenarios, but watching a straight-A student execute a perfect martial arts throw wasn't among them. "Get up," Lily said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard with the authority of someone who'd discovered her strength and decided to claim it. Chase didn't move, couldn't move. His nervous system temporarily scrambled by contact with reality, delivered at approximately 15 miles per hour. The golden boy who'd terrorized Jefferson High for 3 years lay helpless while his victims watched karma arrive precisely on schedule. "Get up," Lily repeated, each word deliberate, as hammer blows. When he finally stirred, groaning as consciousness returned with unwelcome clarity, Lily knelt beside him with movements that somehow managed to be both graceful and threatening. Her voice dropped to a whisper that only he could hear, but every word burned itself into memory with surgical precision. The next time you put your hands on someone without permission, remember this moment. Remember how powerless feels, because I'll be watching. And next time, I won't be so gentle. Principal Robert Sterling arrived with campus security, his dress shoes clicking against concrete as he navigated through crowds that parted like water before authority. At 52, he'd spent 6 years running Jefferson High, long enough to develop instincts that let him read situations before explanations became necessary. Miss Patterson, his voice carried the carefully modulated tone of someone calculating political ramifications while processing unprecedented events. "What is the meaning of this violence, self-defense?" Dylan said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, surprising himself with the conviction that emerged when truth demanded witnesses. Chase attacked her first. "I have video." The crowd murmured agreement, phones displaying evidence that contradicted whatever narrative Sterling might prefer to construct. Truth was becoming harder to bury when everyone carried cameras, when justice could be recorded and replayed and shared across networks that reached far beyond Jefferson's carefully controlled ecosystem. Lily stood, torn dress and all, meeting Sterling's gaze without flinching or apologizing or shrinking into the invisibility that had protected her for 3 years. "Would you like to review the footage?" "Sir?" "All of it?" Sterling's face cycled through expressions like a politician processing voter polling data, recognizing that his next words would determine whether this incident disappeared quietly or exploded beyond his ability to contain. The Hawthorne family's donations had built the new gymnasium, funded the computer lab, ensured that their golden son received the kind of protection that money could provide. But Dylan's video was already spreading, hashtags forming like wildfire across social media platforms that cared nothing for small-town politics or carefully managed reputations. Jefferson High was about to discover that privilege couldn't purchase invisibility in the age of viral justice. Principal Sterling's office had never felt smaller. 3 school board members' phones ringing simultaneously as news of the incident spread through networks that connected wealthy families across 3 counties. Chase's father was already en route with the family attorney, his Bentley cutting through suburban traffic with the urgency of someone whose entire world was suddenly under threat. But technology moved faster than damage control, and Dylan's video had already reached 50,000 views, climbing toward numbers that would attract attention from media outlets hungry for stories about teenage justice and institutional corruption. "This is a complicated situation," Sterling began, his practiced politician voice faltering as he faced the impossible task of protecting multiple constituencies with conflicting interests. "Miss Patterson, perhaps we should discuss alternative educational arrangements." "You mean suspension?" Lily's voice carried new authority, the kind that came from discovering strength and deciding to use it. "For defending myself against assault, Ms. Wells finally found her spine. 3 years of guilt and complicity crystallizing into something that resembled courage." "I saw everything, Robert," she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. Chase grabbed her first, destroyed her property, and created a hostile environment for every student watching. Sterling's face went white, because teachers weren't supposed to challenge authority, weren't supposed to speak truth when lies were more convenient, weren't supposed to remember that their primary obligation was to students, not donors. The investigation began within hours. Federal agencies suddenly interested in patterns of harassment and institutional cover-ups that had protected privileged students while sacrificing vulnerable ones. Department of Education officials arrived with briefcases full of subpoenas, their questions cutting through decades of carefully constructed narratives like knives through silk. Chase Hawthorne's academic record became evidence, revealing systematic grade inflation and fraudulent test scores that had manufactured excellence where mediocrity lived. His prescription Adderall use raised questions about performance enhancement, while his disciplinary history, carefully buried through parental pressure and strategic donations, emerged like archaeologists uncovering buried cities. Emma Richardson's cyberbullying campaigns were documented. Years of psychological torture cataloged in screenshots and testimonies from students who'd finally found courage to speak. Her social media empire crumbled overnight, followers fleeing like rats from sinking ships, sponsors distancing themselves from toxicity that had suddenly become liability. Dylan Cross became an unlikely hero, his video testimony sparking conversations about complicity and courage, about the difference between following power and choosing justice. His scholarship background gave him credibility that privileged voices lacked. His willingness to speak truth, creating space for other victims to emerge from shadows. But the real transformation happened quietly, in hallways where students walked with straightened shoulders, in classrooms where teachers remembered their obligations to protection rather than politics, in administrative offices where policies changed to reflect values rather than donations. Miss Wells discovered her voice, testifying before school boards about administrative pressure and institutional cowardice, about teachers who'd been silenced through fear and students who'd been sacrificed for stability. Her courage created ripples that spread throughout the district, inspiring others to speak truth regardless of consequences. Chase Hawthorne's world collapsed with the systematic precision of controlled demolition, each revelation destroying another pillar of his constructed reality. Harvard rescinded his acceptance, not for the assault, but for the academic fraud that investigation revealed. His father's political connections proved worthless against federal oversight. His family's donations returned with interest and apologies. Sitting in his therapist's office 3 months later, for the first time in his life, Chase was forced to examine why controlling others had felt like survival rather than choice. The prescription medications that had fueled his performance anxiety were replaced with genuine treatment, his superficial confidence slowly giving way to uncomfortable self-awareness. "I destroyed people," he whispered, the admission tasting like poison but feeling like medicine. "I destroyed them because I was already destroyed, because hurting others was easier than healing myself. Recovery would take years, redemption might take longer." But for the first time, Chase Hawthorne was looking at himself without mirrors made of other people's pain. The Golden Boy was learning to become a decent human being, one therapeutic session at a time. Emma Richardson's transformation was equally dramatic. Her social media empire replaced by advocacy work that channeled her communication skills toward construction rather than destruction. Working in Jefferson's tutoring program, helping struggling students instead of mocking them, Emma discovered that building people up felt infinitely better than tearing them down. "I thought power meant making others feel small," she reflected during a school board hearing about bullying prevention programs. "I was wrong. Real power is helping others feel strong, and I want to spend the rest of my high school career proving that people can change." Dylan Cross had found his voice, using journalism skills to document systemic harassment and institutional failure throughout Jefferson's district. His investigative articles earned state awards, while his advocacy work created support systems for students trapped in toxic social dynamics. He testified before congressional committees about complicity and courage, about the difference between following power and choosing justice, about young people's responsibility to speak truth regardless of personal cost. "I was complicit," he told gathered media representatives, his working-class authenticity cutting through political rhetoric like truth through lies. But complicity isn't a life sentence. We can choose differently. And sometimes choosing differently means losing everything you thought mattered to gain everything that actually does. The federal investigation expanded beyond Jefferson High, uncovering patterns of harassment and cover-ups that extended throughout elite educational institutions across 3 states. Congressional hearings examined bullying in private schools. New federal guidelines required transparent reporting of harassment incidents. And suddenly, privilege couldn't protect predators from consequences. Lily Patterson never intended to become a symbol. She just wanted to finish high school in peace. But Dylan's video, now approaching 50 million views, had sparked something bigger than one girl's moment of defiance. Students across America shared their own stories of harassment and institutional failure, creating a movement that politicians couldn't ignore and educators couldn't silence. She was invited to speak at conferences, write opinion pieces, meet with legislators who suddenly cared about problems they'd previously dismissed. Lily declined most requests, preferring to let her actions speak louder than words. But she accepted opportunities that might help other students find their voices. Standing before a congressional subcommittee on educational equity, Lily wore a dress she'd sewn herself, floral patterns created with techniques her grandmother had taught her during precious afternoons that now felt like prophecy. 2 years ago, she told the assembled politicians and cameras, "Someone tried to make me feel small by destroying something I loved. He thought my silence was weakness. He was wrong. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's survival. But when silence becomes complicity in our own oppression, that's when we must find our voices." I didn't fight that day because I was brave. I fought because I was tired of being afraid. And I learned something that changed everything. Our power isn't in making others small. Our power is in refusing to be made small ourselves. The applause was thunderous, but Lily's attention focused on the gallery where she spotted familiar faces. Chase Hawthorne sat in the back, no longer golden but learning to shine with more authentic light. His presence representing hope for redemption rather than threat of retaliation. Dylan Cross took notes for his journalism program, his scholarship to Columbia secured through merit rather than manipulation, his future built on truth-telling rather than power-following. Emma Richardson live-streamed the hearing for her anti-bullying advocacy platform, her social media skills finally serving construction rather than destruction. Ms. Wells had been promoted to district supervisor, her courage during the Jefferson investigation earning recognition and responsibility. Her voice now protecting teachers who chose students over politics, students over safety, justice over convenience. Jefferson High's graduation ceremony felt different 2 years later, not just because of new policies and reformed administration and federal oversight, but because of the quiet girl in the handmade dress sitting in the front row as valedictorian. This dress was different from the one Chase had torn. Lily had sewn it herself, using techniques her grandmother had taught her during afternoons, that now felt like preparation for moments she couldn't have imagined. Floral pattern, cotton fabric, sewn with love, worn with pride. As valedictorian, Lily approached the podium she'd never sought, her speech brief but powerful enough to silence an auditorium filled with teenagers who'd learned that quiet didn't mean weak, that gentle didn't mean helpless, that some people carried strength like hidden weapons until circumstances demanded their revelation. 2 years ago, in this very courtyard, someone tried to make me feel small by destroying something I loved, she began, her voice carrying across silence so complete that even the youngest students held their breath. He thought my silence was weakness. He was wrong. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's survival. But when silence becomes complicity in our own oppression, that's when we must find our voices. I didn't fight that day because I was brave. I fought because I was tired of being afraid. And I learned something that changed everything. Our power isn't in making others small. Our power is in refusing to be made small ourselves. To every quiet kid listening, your voice matters. Your strength matters. You matter. And to anyone who thinks they can silence others, remember this moment. Remember how powerless feels, because we remember. And we're not afraid anymore. As Lily walked across the stage to receive her diploma, the entire graduating class stood in spontaneous ovation. Not for the girl who'd thrown the golden boy, but for the young woman who'd taught them all that real strength protects instead of predates, builds instead of destroys, heals instead of harms. Chase Hawthorne applauded from his seat in the middle section. His own diploma earned through genuine effort rather than manufactured excellence. His future uncertain but authentic in ways that Harvard acceptance had never been. The golden boy had learned to find worth in character rather than conquest, in growth rather than dominance. Dylan Cross cheered from the journalism section, his documentary about Jefferson's transformation already attracting film festival attention, his voice now serving truth rather than power, justice rather than convenience, hope rather than fear. Emma Richardson live-streamed the ceremony for her anti-bullying platform, her follower count smaller but infinitely more meaningful, her influence directed toward healing rather than harming, construction rather than destruction, love rather than fear. And in the front row, watching her granddaughter, metaphorically speaking, receive recognition that privilege couldn't purchase and courage couldn't counterfeit, sat the spirits of every grandmother who'd ever taught young women that strength came in many forms. That gentle didn't mean weak, that sometimes the most powerful people wore the quietest faces. The dress was beautiful, hand-sewn with love and worn with pride. But the girl wearing it was unstoppable. And the movement she'd started was just beginning to change how America thought about power, privilege, protection, and the price of staying silent when speaking up could save lives. Every community has its quiet heroes, people who refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged. Sometimes they're wearing floral dresses. Sometimes they're carrying invisible scars. Always, they're stronger than they appear, braver than they know, more important than they imagine. If this story reminds you of someone who found their voice when it mattered most, someone who chose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, truth over safety, then you understand why some stories demand to be told, retold, shared, until every quiet kid knows they're not alone. Every bully learns there are consequences. Every institution remembers its obligations. Because the best stories aren't the ones we watch. They're the ones we live, the ones we become, the ones we pass forward like grandmother's dresses, sewn with love, worn with pride, protected with everything we have, because some things are too precious to let anyone destroy, too important to keep hidden, too powerful to waste on silence when the world needs voices, needs courage, needs people willing to stand up and say, "Not today, not here, not anymore." The ripping sound had echoed across Jefferson High's courtyard like a gunshot. But the silence that followed Lily Patterson's victory echoed across America like a promise that quiet girls could roar when necessary, that strength came in unexpected packages, that sometimes the most powerful moment in a young person's life began with someone trying to make them feel small and ended with them standing tall enough to change the world. 3 years later, Lily Patterson stood before another podium, this time at Stanford University, where she'd been invited to deliver the commencement address as a sophomore studying education policy and social justice. The girl who'd once hidden her strength now used her voice to amplify others, her scholarship program helping quiet kids across America discover their own power. The Lily Patterson Foundation had quietly funded self-defense programs in over 200 schools, trained teachers to recognize harassment patterns, and created safe reporting systems that couldn't be silenced by wealthy donors or political pressure. But perhaps, most importantly, it had taught an entire generation that silence wasn't always golden. Sometimes it was just fear dressed up in prettier clothes. Dylan Cross had become America's youngest investigative journalist to win a Pulitzer Prize. His documentary series about institutional corruption in elite schools sparking legislative changes that protected vulnerable students nationwide. His working-class voice had become the conscience of educational reform, proving that truth-telling was more powerful than power-following. Chase Hawthorne completed his community service at a domestic violence shelter, where his own journey from predator to protector helped other young men understand that real strength meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down. His transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but every day he chose growth over dominance was a victory that rippled outward like stones in still water. Emma Richardson's anti-bullying platform had evolved into a national movement, her communication skills finally serving construction rather than destruction, her influence directed toward healing communities that had been fractured by teenage cruelty. She'd learned that true popularity came from making others feel included rather than excluded, valued rather than diminished. Ms. Wells had been appointed to the Department of Education's task force on school safety, her teacher's perspective helping craft policies that protected educators who chose courage over comfort, students over politics, justice over convenience. Her voice had found its strength, and now it protected others who were still finding theirs. The warehouse of old Jefferson High had been converted into a community center, offering free counseling services and conflict resolution programs, its hallways now echoing with laughter rather than fear, hope rather than despair, possibility rather than limitation. But the real legacy lived in countless small moments, in quiet kids who found their voices when bullies pushed too far, in teachers who intervened instead of looking away, in administrators who chose protection over politics, in parents who taught their children that real power meant protecting others rather than preying on them. In schools across America, Lily's story had become legend, told and retold until every quiet kid knew they weren't alone. Every bully understood there were consequences. Every institution remembered its obligations to protect rather than profit, to serve rather than silence, to lift up rather than tear down. The floral dress her grandmother had sewn with trembling hands now hung in the Smithsonian, part of an exhibit about teenage activism and social change. But the real dress, the one Lily had sewn herself using those same loving techniques, continued to be worn with pride, a symbol that some things were too precious to let anyone destroy, too important to keep hidden, too powerful to waste on silence when the world needed voices, needed courage, needed people willing to stand up and transform pain into purpose, fear into strength, silence into the kind of roar that changes everything.